It is the morning of 27th August, 1941, and somewhere in the grey chop of the North Atlantic, a Royal Navy corvette is closing on a surfaced German submarine. The U-boat U-570, a Type 7 vessel out of Kiel, has been depth-charged into submission by an RAF Hudson aircraft and is now wallowing helpless on the surface, her crew emerging through the conning tower hatch with their hands raised and a white shirt tied to the periscope standard. The first British boarding party reaches the stricken vessel within the hour. They come armed, they come prepared for resistance, for booby traps, for the frantic destruction of codebooks and cipher equipment. They come expecting, in short, everything that a crew of German submariners trained for exactly this eventuality might throw at them. What they do not expect is what happens next. Because the first British sailor to drop through the conning tower hatch and make his way into the cramped interior of a German U-boat does not immediately encounter resistance. He does not encounter frantic sabotage. He encounters, blinking in the dim red emergency lighting of the forward torpedo room, a group of men who are not looking at his rifle. They are looking at the ration tin in his belt pouch. They are looking at it the way men look at things they have not seen in a very long time. And in that moment, in that absurd, unglamorous, entirely unplanned instant, something shifts. It is not the depth charges that have broken this crew. It is not the fear of capture, or the cold of the Atlantic, or the knowledge that their boat is finished. It is the tin, the ordinary, dented, mass-produced tin of British corned beef that a Royal Navy rating has been carrying in his rations pouch since he left port. This is the story of how food, the most basic, the most human, the most thoroughly unmilitary thing in the world, became one of the most quietly devastating psychological weapons of the entire Battle of the Atlantic. To understand what a British ration tin meant to a German U-boat crewman in 1941 and 1942, it is necessary to understand the conditions under which those men lived and fought. The Type 7 sea U-boat. The workhorse of the Kriegsmarine's submarine fleet was 67 metres long and 6 metres wide at its broadest point. It carried a crew of between 44 and 52 men. It was designed for endurance patrols lasting between 6 and 12 weeks. It carried, at the outset of each patrol, sufficient provisions for that duration. In the first weeks of a patrol, the food was adequate. German naval provisioning in the early war years was, by the standards of the time, reasonably generous. Fresh bread was baked in small built-in ovens. There was tinned meat, preserved sausage, hard cheese. For the first fortnight, a U-boat crew ate well enough by the standards of wartime Germany. After the first fortnight, the fresh provisions ran out. What remained was tinned food, and the conditions inside a submerged or partially submerged submarine were not kind to tins. The constant condensation that plagued every Type 7C, the moisture that dripped from every pipe, that soaked every bunk, that left a man's clothes perpetually damp for the duration of a patrol, meant that the outer labels of tins dissolved within days. By week 3 of a standard Atlantic patrol, the crew was eating from unlabelled cans and hoping for the best. The situation was grim enough that the crew had a word for this lottery. Blinde Kuh, which translates loosely as blind cow, a children's guessing game. You opened a tin and you found out what you were eating. But the labelling was the least of it. As the war extended into 1941 and 1942, the blockade that Britain was running in reverse, the effort to strangle Germany's supply lines that mirrored Germany's effort to strangle Britain's, began to bite. German naval provisions became shorter, leaner, less varied. The Wehrmacht and the civilian population were being fed first, the Kriegsmarine second, and within the Kriegsmarine, the submarine service, despite its extraordinary strategic importance, was frequently at the bottom of the provisioning queue. A patrol that had begun with 44 men and 6 weeks of reasonable food was, by week 4, a patrol running on bread that had long since gone green, on tinned meat of uncertain vintage, and on the kind of hot, black ersatz coffee that tasted primarily of desperation. The average German submariner by the middle of 1942 was, by the time he was captured or surfaced in distress, somewhere between hungry and genuinely malnourished. The physical evidence of this was noted in intelligence reports compiled at HMS Devonport and at the Admiralty's prisoner of war interrogation facility in London with a consistency that eventually demanded systematic attention. Men from captured U-boats were, on average, lighter than their service records suggested they should be. Their teeth showed signs of dietary deficiency. Their reaction to food, specifically to the sight, smell, and presence of British service rations, was documented in interrogation notes with a frequency that moved from anecdote to pattern to institutional fact. The question for British naval intelligence was not whether this pattern existed. It manifestly did. The question was whether it could be used. The deliberate exploitation of food as a psychological tool in the capture and interrogation of U-boat crews did not originate in any single memorandum or directive. It grew in the way that the most effective wartime innovations often grew, from the accumulated observations of the men who were actually doing the work. The boarding parties and interrogation officers of the Royal Navy's Anti-Submarine Warfare Command, operating from bases including HMS Eaglet in Liverpool, HMS Osprey in Portland, and the Admiralty's dedicated U-boat intelligence section in Whitehall, began from approximately mid-1941 onwards to notice and then to codify what the evidence was telling them. The codification took the form of standing guidance to boarding party commanders. It was not dramatic. It was not classified at any particularly high level. It was, in the straightforward bureaucratic language of the Royal Navy, a set of practical instructions. Boarding parties were advised to carry visible rations, specifically including tinned corned beef, ship's biscuits, tinned fruit, and where available blocks of plain chocolate, not concealed in packs but accessible, visible, present. The reasoning was stated plainly: a hungry man is a cooperative man, and a cooperative man talks. The specific items were not chosen arbitrarily. Corned beef, Fray Bentos brand where available, produced at the company's plant in Fray Bentos, Uruguay, and imported in enormous quantities to Britain throughout the war, came in the distinctive flat oval tin that had become by 1941 almost a symbol of British wartime endurance. It was recognisable. It was calorie-dense. A single 340-gram tin contained sufficient protein and fat to constitute a meaningful meal. More importantly, for a man who had been eating ersatz, everything for 6 weeks in a damp steel tube, 60 metres below the surface of the North Atlantic, a tin of Fray Bentos corned beef was not just food. It was an emblem of a world in which food simply existed, in which you could open a tin and find something that tasted of meat rather than of tin and seawater, and however many weeks of submersion. The chocolate component deserves separate mention. British service chocolate, produced by Rowntree's and Cadbury's at their respective factories in York and Birmingham, was, by the caloric and flavour standards available to Germany in 1941 and 1942, almost incomprehensibly good. German ersatz chocolate by this period contained a proportion of chalk as a bulking agent. British service chocolate contained cocoa butter, sugar, and milk solids in proportions that a German submariner, encountering it for the first time, could not always quite believe. Interrogation reports from late 1941 and early 1942 note, with a matter-of-factness that is itself rather extraordinary, that the distribution of Rowntree's chocolate to newly captured U-boat crew members produced a psychological state that one interrogating officer described in his notes as markedly amenable. Production numbers for Fray Bentos tins destined for naval boarding party rations remain, in the National Archives files, somewhat incomplete. What is documented is that by early 1942, the practice of provisioning boarding parties with visible, accessible rations had been formalised across the Western Approaches Command, covering the operational area that encompassed the North Atlantic convoy routes, where the majority of U-boat captures and boardings took place. The operational record of what happened when British boarding parties, provisioned in this manner, encountered German U-boat crews is documented in a series of Admiralty files that became progressively more accessible to researchers following declassification proceedings in the 1990s and 2000s. The cases are not all identical. Not every capture involved a dramatic reaction to food, but the pattern is there, repeated with sufficient consistency across enough separate incidents to be meaningful. In the case of U-570, captured on 27 August 1941 and subsequently recommissioned into the Royal Navy as HMS Graf, the boarding party accounts describe a crew that was physically and psychologically exhausted after the depth charging and subsequent hours on the surface in Atlantic conditions. Several crew members, according to the boarding party commander's report, were visibly unsteady. The distribution of rations before the formal transfer to naval custody was noted as having had AA, and this is the phrase used in the original document, materially calming effect on proceedings. HMS Graf, as U-570 became, Oikerin Sikamaan, spent the rest of the war in Royal Navy service. The intelligence gathered from her capture, including cipher materials, navigation equipment, and the direct testimony of her crew during subsequent interrogation, was described by the Admiralty's Submarine Intelligence Section as among the most valuable single haul of the early Battle of the Atlantic. The captures of U-110 in May 1941, from which the famous Enigma material was recovered in a boarding operation led by Lieutenant David Balm, and U-559 in October 1942, from which additional Enigma rotors were recovered at the cost of 2 British lives. Both involved elements of the same dynamic. In both cases, the state of the German crew, their exhaustion, their hunger, their psychological brittleness after weeks at sea, was a factor that the boarding party commanders had been briefed to exploit through the straightforward mechanism of visible, accessible food. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The psychological impact extended beyond the moment of capture. Interrogation reports compiled at the London Cage, the facility at Kensington Palace Gardens used for the interrogation of high-value prisoners, note repeatedly that U-boat officers who had been treated to a proper British meal before formal questioning were substantially more cooperative than those who had not. The intelligence value of this cooperation was not trivial. Information extracted from cooperative U-boat commanders contributed directly to the operational picture that allowed the Western Approaches Command to route convoys away from known U-boat patrol areas, a contribution that is estimated, with all appropriate uncertainty, to have saved dozens of vessels and thousands of lives. Comparing British practice with German equivalents reveals, as it so often does in this war, a fundamental difference in institutional approach. The Kriegsmarine was not, in the early years of the war, particularly concerned with the capture and interrogation of Allied naval personnel as a source of strategic intelligence. The submarine service was focused, entirely and overwhelmingly, on tonnage. The metric by which success was measured in the U-boat arm was the number of Allied vessels sunk and the gross tonnage represented by those vessels. The human dimensions of naval warfare, the psychological state of enemy crews, the intelligence value of cooperative prisoners, the long-term strategic implications of how captured men were treated, were not priorities in a command culture that was, at its highest levels, oriented entirely around the sinking ledger. The result of this orientation was that Germany, despite capturing significant numbers of Allied naval personnel throughout the Battle of the Atlantic, extracted relatively modest intelligence value from those captures compared with what the British were extracting from theirs. The contrast is not absolute. German naval intelligence was competent, and in some areas excellent. But in the specific domain of prisoner exploitation, as a systematic intelligence tool, the British approach was substantially more sophisticated. The American entry into the war in December 1941 brought a different set of practices and priorities. The United States Navy, building its anti-submarine capacity from near zero in the wake of Pearl Harbor, absorbed British practice in this area relatively quickly. By 1943, USN boarding party doctrine in the Atlantic had incorporated British guidance on the provisioning and conduct of captures, including the food protocol. American interrogation facilities at Fort Hunt in Virginia, known by the deliberately understated designation P.O. Box 1142, adopted a similar approach to the use of food and basic comfort as tools of initial psychological engagement, though with characteristic American abundance, the rations available tended toward rather more generosity than the British version. The German Navy's attempt to address its own provisioning crisis through the deployment of so-called Milchkühe, milk cows, the Type 14 supply submarines that were supposed to extend U-boat patrol duration by replenishing their provisions at sea, was tactically interesting, but strategically insufficient. The 14 Type 14 boats were all sunk by 1944, and the provisioning crisis they were meant to solve continued to worsen throughout the later years of the Atlantic campaign, contributing to the deterioration of crew quality and morale that became increasingly visible in the capture evidence from 1943 onwards. Assessing the actual strategic impact of this practice is, necessarily, a matter of inference and estimation, rather than precise calculation. No single document in the National Archives states, in direct terms, how many convoys were saved, how many lives preserved, how many strategic decisions influenced by intelligence that flowed from cooperative U-boat prisoners, who became cooperative, at least in part because they were hungry, and a British boarding party rating was carrying a tin of Fray Bentos in his belt pouch. What the documents do show is a pattern of intelligence extraction from U-boat captures that was, by the standards of the time, remarkably effective. Of the approximately 40 U-boats captured or boarded with crew intact during the course of the Battle of the Atlantic, a substantial proportion yielded intelligence of what the Admiralty classified as Category A value, the highest grade. The correlation between the quality of intelligence extracted and the quality of the initial contact between boarding party and crew is not a correlation that is explicitly drawn in any single Admiralty document, but it is one that is visible across the record as a whole. The broader legacy of this practice extends into the post-war development of what became known, in the language of later military doctrine, as HUMINT, human intelligence, the craft of extracting information from human sources. The systematic use of basic physiological needs, food, warmth, rest, as tools of initial engagement before formal interrogation, became a foundational element of Western intelligence doctrine in the post-war period. The precise lineage of that doctrine runs through a great many places and a great many practices. But the boarding party guidance of the Western Approaches Command in 1941 and 1942 is among its authentic antecedents. Several of the physical artefacts of this story survive. HMS Graf, the former U-570, was run aground off the Hebrides in 1944 after sustaining storm damage, and portions of her wreck remain on the seabed. Fray Bentos corned beef, in the distinctive oval tin, continues to be manufactured and sold. Rowntree's chocolate, under the Nestlé ownership that absorbed the York factory in 1988, continues in production. The Admiralty files that document the practice are available at the National Archives at Kew in the ADM series, though some elements remain subject to ongoing review. Return for a moment to that boarding party rating on the morning of 27th August, 1941. He does not know that he is participating in anything historically significant. He does not know that the practice he is following, carrying visible rations, making them available to the men he is taking prisoner, has been formalised into doctrine, that it flows from months of accumulated observation, that it represents a considered institutional response to a pattern identified by interrogation officers and boarding party commanders across the Western Approaches. He knows that he is in a German submarine that smells extraordinarily bad, that the men around him look like they have not slept properly in 3 weeks, and that one of them is staring at his ration pouch with an expression that is difficult to describe but easy to understand. He offers the tin, the German sailor takes it, and in that moment, in that small, unglamorous, entirely human exchange, the offering and the taking, the hunger and the satisfaction of hunger, something that no depth charge and no cipher machine and no strategic directive could have produced by itself is produced. A man decides not to fight, a man decides to cooperate, a man decides perhaps to talk. Across 40 U-boat captures, across hundreds of interrogations, across years of accumulated intelligence that shaped convoy routes and patrol dispositions, and the slowly grinding attrition of the Battle of the Atlantic. Multiply that moment by itself across the length and breadth of a naval campaign that cost over 30,000 British lives, and turned, in the end, on margins that history still debates. The British did not win the Battle of the Atlantic with depth charges alone. They did not win it with As Dick alone, or with Bletchley Park alone, or with the convoys and the escorts, and the long-range aircraft and the tactical doctrines developed at great cost over 6 years of the hardest naval fighting in modern history. They won it with all of those things, and with the ration tin, and with the knowledge, the institutional, accumulated unromantic knowledge, that a hungry man is a cooperative man, and a cooperative man talks not a weapon, not a cipher, not a strategy, a tin of meat,